Ever get that feeling like you want to be in the know, really grasp the big picture, but don't have hours to spend digging through research?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, you want the insights without all the slogging through endless articles and books.
That's exactly what we do here on the deep dive. You share what you've been exploring, and we pull out the truly surprising stuff, the really crucial
The
insights.
stuff that'll stick with you. The
Yeah.
things that'll make you go, huh, I never thought of it that way.
And you've sent us some fascinating stuff this time around. We're going deep on the surprising and strange relationship between flavor and nutrition.
Yeah, the stuff we're diving into today, it's all based on Mark Schatzker's book, The Dorito Effect.
So, our mission today, to put it simply, is to understand how flavor in our food has changed over time and what those changes mean for our health and eating habits.
It turns out it's more complicated than you might think.
Mm.
Like, way more complicated.
Okay, so one of the first things that really jumps out from the book is this connection that Schatzker makes between these changes in our food and the rising rates of obesity.
Right, like think about this. CDC data shows that in the early 1960s, around 13.4% of American adults were obese.
13.4%.
But then, just a decade later, that number had already climbed to 14.5%.
So that's more than a 1% increase in just 10 years.
Exactly, and it's even more significant when you consider that other ways of measuring body fat also show increases during that same period.
So what's going on here? Is it just that we're eating more calories overall, or is there something else at play?
Well, Schatzker's big argument is that we've been messing with the want part of eating, the desire, the craving for food.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this what part.
We often focus so much on individual nutrients like sugar, fat, and carbs, but Schatzker says that flavor itself is a huge factor, maybe even the most important one.
So it's not just about what's in the food, it's also about how it makes us feel.
Exactly. He makes this really interesting analogy to smoking. We say cigarettes are deadly because they cause cancer, but that's just the mechanism, the how.
Right, but it's the addiction that really makes people smoke.
Exactly. It's the wanting that drives the behavior.
Hmm.
And he says it's the same with food.
It's the craving that makes us eat, even when we're not truly hungry.
And he connects this idea to Jean Needich, the founder of Weight Watchers. She actually struggled a lot with overeating.
I can relate to that.
And she even coined this term Frankenstein foods for things like Malamars, foods that she just couldn't resist. They triggered this almost uncontrollable desire in her.
Oh yeah, Malamars, those are dangerous.
It wasn't about her body metabolizing food differently. It was about her wanting to eat so much of these specific things.
So flavor, according to Schatzker, is food's way of really tapping into that primal want.
Precisely.
Okay, so this brings up a really important question for me. How did we start messing with flavor in the first place?
Well, Schatzker points to this really interesting moment in history, the story of Arch West and the invention of Doritos. Yeah. The legend goes
I'm all ears.
that West was driving somewhere between Los Angeles and San Diego, and he stopped at this little roadside shack.
Okay, a roadside shack. Picture it.
And they had these amazing, super crunchy tortilla chips.
That crunch, there's something special about it.
Right, and that was the magic. West was already marketing Fritos, which are also fried cornmeal, but the way tortilla chips are made, they just have this different snap.
Oh yeah, that satisfying snap.
And West, he saw the potential immediately. Doritos were born. But what Schatzker really emphasizes is the bigger picture. It was this moment when flavor became something that could be engineered, designed. It wasn't just what nature provided anymore.
Flavor went from being inherent to being, what, manufactured.
Exactly. And here's the thing. At the same time this was happening, around the middle of the 20th century, the natural flavor in a lot of our food, like fruits and vegetables, it was actually starting to decline.
What do you mean decline?
Think about corn and potatoes. By 1967, American corn farms were producing almost 3 times as much corn per acre as they were in 1932. And potato yields had more than tripled since the mid-1930s.
Wow, so much more food. That sounds like a good thing, right?
It sounds good, but there's a catch. This focus on producing more food, more volume, came at a cost. The taste, the flavor wasn't as good. The corn wasn't as intensely corny. The potatoes weren't as potatoy.
They were losing their flavor.
Exactly. We were becoming bland. And that's where flavor technology comes in.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Suddenly you could have these bright, flavorful orange drinks without any actual oranges in them. And Doritos, well, they took a simple piece of fried corn and gave it all the flavor of a full Mexican meal.
It's like they were making up for the missing flavor in the actual ingredients.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And at first, people weren't too concerned about these flavor enhancers, things like Tarula yeast or MSG. They weren't adding a lot of calories, so the thinking was, what's the harm?
So there was the shift from relying on nature's flavor to creating it in a lab.
Exactly. And even Arch West, the guy who invented Doritos, he knew flavor was key. He said, flavor matters. He understood that eating isn't just about fueling our bodies, it's about pleasure.
Yeah, like why else would we spend so much time and energy thinking about food and cooking and trying new
He
things?
even compared it to sex. You know,
Hmm.
it's not just about procreation, it's about pleasure. Flavor is the original craving, he said.
I love that. Flavor is the original craving.
Right. So we've talked about the rise of artificial flavor, but what about the decline in flavor of natural foods? You mentioned earlier this story about the woman trying to recreate her mother's chicken and dumplings,
Oh, yeah, that one really got to me. It's a story about this woman who, for years, she tried and tried to make chicken and dumplings that tasted like her mother's, but she could never get it quite right.
and she finally cracked the code.
Finally, she found this specific type of chicken, a barred rock chicken from a farmer named Frank Reese. And when her husband tasted it, he immediately said, "This is my mother's chicken and dumplings." It was that emotional.
Wow, so it was the chicken itself that made the difference.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what changed. Why don't our chickens taste like they used to?
Well, Schatzker talks about this contest in the mid-20th century, the Chicken of Tomorrow contest.
Chicken of tomorrow. What is that?
It was this big competition to create the ideal chicken for mass production. But here's the thing. They weren't judging the chickens on flavor. They were focused on appearance. You know, how appealing they looked on a platter and how fast they grew.
So flavor wasn't even a consideration.
Not really. And that's how we ended up with the modern broiler chicken, a chicken that grows at an incredible speed. I mean, one poultry researcher, Paul Siegel, he said that if humans grew at the same rate as these chickens, a newborn baby would weigh 660 pounds after just 2 months.
660 pounds in 2 months. That's insane.
I know, right? And even Siegel himself admits that these modern chickens might not taste like the chickens he remembers from his childhood, the ones his mother used to make fricassee with.
So we've traded flavor for efficiency.
In a way, yes. And it's not just chicken. A cookbook from 1961, it actually talks about how modern poultry farming produces chickens that are affordable and look good, but rarely taste good. The author even says that this bland chicken needs strong dousings of herbs, wines, and spices to make it palatable.
It's like that Doritos analogy again, adding flavor to compensate for what's missing.
Exactly. And this is a stark contrast to how Julia Child talked about chicken in that same year, 1961. She said chicken should be so good in itself that you can enjoy it even plain. But just a few decades later, chicken was being described as downright bland, a blank slate for whatever flavors you want to add.
So it's not just an occasional bland chicken, it's become the standard.
And this decline in flavor isn't limited to chicken. Schatzker also discusses this idea of nutritional dilution, which he explores through research published in Organic Gardening magazine and the work of a biochemist named Donald Davis.
Nutritional dilution, what is that exactly?
Well, Davis compared the nutrient levels in fruits and vegetables from the 1930s and 1950s to those from the late 20th century. And he made sure to account for differences in moisture content, so he was really looking at the density of nutrients.
Okay, and what did he find?
He found that a lot of essential micronutrients were less concentrated in the modern fruits and vegetables. But he also noticed this dilution effect.
So the produce was more watery.
Exactly. And that's the key connection to flavor. If a fruit or vegetable has a higher percentage of water, it's going to taste more watery and less flavorful overall. The aromatic compounds that give them their taste, they become diluted.
So our modern agricultural practices, with their emphasis on producing more, bigger, faster, they've actually made our food less flavorful.
That's a big part of it, yes.
Let's talk a bit more about how these practices affect flavor, specifically with chicken.
Sure. So traditionally, chickens ate a wide variety of things. Grass, bugs, seeds, scraps from the kitchen, whatever they could find. Farmers didn't really understand their exact nutritional needs back then.
Chickens were just kind of foraging for whatever they needed.
Exactly. But then came the discovery of vitamins, thanks to scientists like Christian Eichmann and Casimir Funk. This was a huge breakthrough. It helped prevent diseases like breadberry.
Right, vitamins are essential.
Absolutely. But this discovery also led to a big change in how chickens were raised. Once scientists knew which nutrients animals needed, feed manufacturers started putting synthetic versions of those vitamins and minerals directly into chicken feed.
So the chickens didn't need to forage anymore.
Not really. They could get all their nutrients in a controlled indoor environment. And this made it possible to really focus on maximizing growth, getting them to market weight as quickly as possible. They were fed this high-energy diet full of carbs, the fuel for rapid growth.
But what about the flavor?
Well, that diverse diet of grass, bugs, and all that, it disappeared. And just like a cow that eats onion grass will produce milk that tastes like onions, what Schatzker calls biodistribution, a chicken's diet directly affects the flavor of its meat.
So their flavor became as uniform as their diet.
Precisely. And it wasn't just about what they weren't eating anymore, it was also about what they were eating. The grains in their feed, they were also bred for high yield, often at the expense of flavor. So these chickens were basically eating a bland diet from start to finish.
Even if they were getting all the necessary nutrients, they weren't getting the variety of flavors that would make them taste good.
Exactly. They might not have been deficient in nutrients, but they were definitely experiencing a flavor brownout, as Schatzker puts it.
So it's this combination of factors, the focus on rapid growth, the controlled environment, and the bland feed, that has led to this widespread lack of flavor in chicken.
And this really sets the stage for the rise of artificial flavor. It's like the food industry had to find a way to compensate for this missing flavor to make their products appealing again.
And one of the most interesting examples of this is the story of artificial vanilla.
Ah, yes, the vanilla crisis.
What happened?
Well, in the 1970s, there was this big political upheaval in Madagascar, which was the main source of vanilla beans at the time. The vanilla industry was nationalized, and prices went through the roof.
So real vanilla became really expensive.
Extremely expensive. And for a company like McCormick, which uses tons of vanilla in its products, this was a huge problem.
They had to find a cheaper alternative.
And that's exactly what they did. They set out to create an artificial vanilla flavor that would be indistinguishable from the real thing.
Wow, that's a tall order. How did they even begin to do that?
They started by analyzing natural vanilla, breaking it down into its hundreds of different chemical compounds. They wanted to create a kind of map of vanilla flavor to identify the key molecules responsible for its unique taste and aroma.
I remember that story in the book about the resinous note that they were trying so hard to capture.
Oh yeah, that's a great example of the lengths they went to. They were using this technique called gas chromatography to separate the different compounds in vanilla. And they had these professional sniffers, sensory panels, trying to describe each aroma.
Professional sniffers, that's a job I never knew existed.
Right. And these sniffers kept detecting this subtle resinous note that they couldn't quite replicate with their artificial formulations.
So what did they do?
One of their flavorists, he sat down by the gas chromatograph and started sniffing each individual compound as it came out. And finally he found it, this faint, almost leathery aroma. And the peak on the chromatogram for that compound, it was tiny, almost invisible.
Wow, they really went all out.
They were determined. And this breakthrough, along with many others, led to what Schatzker calls the Great Flavor Migration.
What's that?
It's the idea that one by one, the chemicals that give our food its flavor, they stopped being extracted from nature and started being manufactured in factories. The number of these commercially available flavor chemicals has exploded since 1965. You can literally order almost any flavor you can imagine.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. And it's not just simple flavors like orange or strawberry. They're creating complex flavors like mustard, horseradish, wasabi, and even raw potato.
Wow, raw potato flavor, that's specific.
And we can't forget about umami, that savory, satisfying taste. They've mastered that too, starting with MSG and moving on to other compounds like glutathione, which is found in garlic.
So they're not just manipulating the basic tastes like sweet, sour, salty, and bitter, but also the aromas that we smell, which are a huge part of flavor.
Exactly. Think about bacon. It wouldn't be nearly as delicious without that smoky aroma.
So true. And it's really interesting to compare natural vanilla with its hundreds of different aromatic compounds to artificial vanilla, which is often just vanillin, a single molecule.
It's like the difference between a symphony orchestra and a single instrument.
It's amazing that they can even get close with just one molecule.
I know. It's impressive. But even with all their advances, they can't fully replicate the complexity of natural flavor.
And what's fascinating is that McCormick, a company that was built on selling natural spices, is now one of the biggest players in the artificial flavor industry.
It's ironic, isn't it?
It is. And what's even more mind-blowing is how deeply McCormick has infiltrated the food industry. They provide custom flavor solutions for almost all of the top food companies in America.
So chances are you're eating their flavorings all the time without even knowing it.
It's like they're the puppet masters of flavor.
In a way, yes. And Schatzker makes this great analogy about the cracker aisle in the supermarket.
Oh yeah, what was that?
He talks about all these different cracker brands competing for your attention, and the food companies are constantly trying to figure out what consumers want.
And that's where McCormick comes in with their flavor solutions.
Exactly. They can create the perfect sizzle sauce for your fajitas or the ultimate lemon flavor for your cookies.
They've got a flavor for every occasion.
And it really shows how important flavor is to us. We crave it, we seek it out. It's a universal human desire.
It's like flavor is the language of food and McCormick is the translator.
That's a good way to put it. And then there's this whole debate about natural versus artificial flavors, which is kind of funny when you think about it.
How so?
Well, the molecules themselves can be exactly the same, but the label depends on how they were made.
So it's more about the process than the actual flavor.
Exactly. And a lot of flavor chemists think this distinction is kind of silly, but marketers know that consumers care about it.
So it's more of a marketing tactic than anything else.
In a way, yes. And what's really surprising is how widespread the use of synthetic flavors has become. It's not just in processed food anymore, it's even in things like raw chicken, pork, and beef.
You're kidding.
Nope. If you look at the ingredient list for Tyson chicken or Smithfield pork, you'll often see natural flavorings listed.
So it's not just the Doritos and the candy bars, it's in practically everything.
It's everywhere. Chocolate chips, salad dressings, deli meats, even raw sirloin burgers, and pasta sauce.
That's like a lot of our food just doesn't taste good enough on its own anymore.
And even butter, which used to be the gold standard of flavor, now often has added flavorings.
Butter? Seriously.
Seriously. It's because of what Schatzker calls flavor dilution in milk. Modern dairy cows produce way more milk than they used to, and their diet isn't as diverse.
So the milk itself is less flavorful.
And that translates to less flavorful butter.
It's kind of sad, isn't it?
It is. And it shows how big the flavor industry has become. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, both in the U.S. and globally.
So this isn't just a small niche market. This is a major force in our food system.
Absolutely. And as Schatzker puts it, year by year, the food we eat is becoming more and more like Doritos.
That's a sobering thought. So what are the consequences of all this? What does it mean for our eating habits and our health?
Well, let's go back to Jean Neededge and her Frankenstein foods. Those foods that are so craveable, we just can't resist them.
Oh yeah, I know those all too well.
Schatzker talks about this study called Neural Correlates of Food Addiction that looked at how people's brains respond to highly palatable foods.
What did they find?
They found that people who score high on food addiction scales, they actually crave food more than they enjoy it. They have this intense desire for the food, but once they eat it, the pleasure isn't as great as they expected.
So it's like the anticipation is better than the actual experience.
Exactly. And it creates this cycle where you keep craving more and more to try to satisfy that desire.
And that's how you end up overeating.
Right. And one of the researchers in the study said that in this environment of super palatable food, healthier, more natural foods don't have a chance.
They just can't compete with the Doritos and the ice cream and all that.
And a big part of this is the role of salt, sugar, and fat. These ingredients, they act like rewards for our brains, triggering the same pathways that are activated by addictive drugs.
So we're basically hardwired to crave these things.
In a way, yes.
No.
And sugar is particularly potent.
That explains my sweet tooth.
But Schatzker makes a really important point. It's not just about the potency of junk food. It's also about the availability. He compares it to heroin use among soldiers in Vietnam.
What's the connection there?
Well, a lot of soldiers used heroin in Vietnam, but when they came home, most of them didn't become addicts.
Interesting. So it's not just the drug itself, it's the context, the environment.
Exactly. And he says it's the same with junk food. It's not just that it's so delicious, it's also that it's everywhere.
So the problem isn't just the junk food, it's also the blandness of our real food.
Right. We're not getting the same satisfaction from our fruits, vegetables, and meat, so we turn to junk food to make up for it.
It's like a vicious cycle.
And it all goes back to that high-energy diet for chickens. The same principle applies to other farm animals like pigs and cattle. They're bred to grow quickly, but that often comes at the expense of flavor.
So it's not just chickens, it's the entire food system.
And when you think about it, it's no surprise that obesity rates are so high. The vast majority of Americans are either overweight or obese.
So is Schatzker saying that flavorings are the main cause of the obesity epidemic?
He's not saying they're the only cause, but he does think they're a missing piece of the puzzle.
How so?
Well, he points out that a lot of the foods that are linked to overeating, like milkshakes, Melamars, and even that fruit punch drink, they all contain flavorings, either natural or artificial.
So it's not just the sugar or the fat, it's the flavor that makes them so appealing.
Exactly. He calls this the flavor goggles effect, how flavor can make something bland seem irresistible.
So if flavor is part of the problem, what's the solution?
Schatzker believes that we need to move away from this idea that deliciousness is bad. That something tastes good, it must be unhealthy.
So we need to embrace flavor, but the right kind of flavor.
Exactly. He says that real flavor, the authentic version produced in nature, is our only road to salvation.
That's a powerful statement.
And he talks about how our sense of smell is so sophisticated, it's designed to help us appreciate food.
Yeah, I never really thought about it that way, but it's true.
Our noses are like these amazing sensory instruments. And while we might not be as good at smelling as dogs, we're still incredibly sensitive to a wide range of aromas.
Remember those flavorists sniffing out the resinous note in vanilla?
Exactly. And this brings up a really fundamental question. Why do things have flavor in the first place?
That's a good question.
Schatzker introduces this concept of nutritional wisdom based on the work of a researcher named Frederick Provenza. The idea is that animals, including humans, can learn to choose foods that meet their nutritional needs based on feedback they get from their bodies after eating.
So it's like our bodies are telling us what we need through flavor.
In a way, yes. Provenza did this study with goats, where they learned to eat bitter black brush to get rid of parasites, and even the wood from abandoned wood rat houses to get certain minerals.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It shows that animals can develop a taste for things they need, even if they don't taste good at first.
So our taste preferences aren't just random, they're connected to our biology.
And Provenza did more studies with sheep, where they developed preferences for different flavors based on their nutritional needs. Like, some sheep learned to prefer coconut, some preferred maple, some preferred calcium, and some preferred carbs, all depending on what their bodies needed.
So it's not just about liking sweet things or salty things, it's about our bodies craving specific nutrients.
And Schatzker also talks about the work of an entomologist named Gottfried Frankl, who said that not all bad substances in plants are completely negative.
What do you mean?
Well, some insects are actually attracted to certain plant toxins. Like monarch butterflies, they eat milkweed, which is toxic, but it helps them defend themselves against predators.
So sometimes what seems bad can actually be good, depending on the context.
And all of this really points to the complexity of the plant world, with its vast array of chemical compounds. And flavor, our sense of smell and taste, is our way of navigating this world, of figuring out what's good for us and what's not.
It's like our taste buds are our guides.
Exactly. And there was this amazing study done by a pediatrician named Clara Davis in the 1920s, where she let infants choose their own food from a variety of unprocessed options.
What happened?
The babies instinctively chose balanced and nutritious diets.
Yep.
And when they got sick, they would even change their food choices, seemingly to help themselves heal.
Wow, so even babies have this innate nutritional wisdom.
And our love for ripe fruit, it's not just about the sugar, it's also about all the other compounds that develop as fruit matures.
So a ripe strawberry is not just sweeter, it's also more flavorful overall.
Exactly. And think about the coffee and wine industries. They go to great lengths to bring out the complex flavors in their products. They're constantly battling against flavor dilution.
And that historical example of scurvy on ships, it really shows how powerful our cravings for specific foods can be.
Right, those sailors were desperate for fresh fruits and vegetables. Their bodies were craving vitamin C.
It's like their bodies knew what they needed.
And there's this interesting anecdote about Gary Beauchamp, a researcher who noticed that ibuprofen and olive oil both create this peppery sensation in the throat.
Really?
It turns out that they both contain compounds that have anti-inflammatory properties.
So sometimes an unpleasant taste can actually be a sign of something healthy.
And the Mediterranean diet, with its emphasis on olive oil and fresh produce, is a great example of how deliciousness and health can go hand in hand.
Okay, so let's talk about artificial sweeteners and other flavor tricks. How do they affect our relationship with food?
Well, the thing about artificial sweeteners is that they're calorie-free, but they don't seem to be helping people lose weight or be healthier.
So what's going on?
Some research suggests that they might actually mess with our metabolism, because they trick our bodies into thinking we're getting calories when we're not.
So our bodies get confused.
Right. And brain imaging studies show that people who regularly use artificial sweeteners have different brain responses to sweet tastes.
So it's like their brains are being rewired.
And then there's the whole issue of flavor being used as a kind of bait and switch, like with flavored cigarettes.
So it's about getting people hooked on the flavor so they'll consume whatever's delivering it.
Exactly. And flavor companies are getting really good at replicating natural flavors. There's even this thing called the virtual aroma synthesizer that can create almost any flavor you can imagine.
It's like science fiction becoming reality.
And they're using children panels to help them design the most appealing flavors for kids.
So they're really targeting children with these intense flavors.
And there's research that shows that these added flavors can actually make people eat more, even if they're not getting any extra nutrients.
Like they're tricking our bodies into thinking we're eating a variety of foods when we're not.
Exactly. Fred Provenza did this study with sheep where he gave them flavored hay, and they eat more of the flavored hay, even though it was nutritionally the same as the plain hay.
So the flavor itself was enough to make them eat more.
And the same thing happens with rats. They eat more when they're given a variety of flavors, even if the food is all the same.
And this probably applies to kids too, right? Like they're more likely to eat a bowl of sugary cereal with all sorts of different colors and flavors than a bowl of plain oatmeal.
Exactly. And the problem is that these intensely flavored foods can prevent kids from developing a taste for healthier, more natural foods.
So they're getting hooked on these artificial flavors early on.
And it all goes back to the discovery of vitamins. Once we figured out how to add synthetic vitamins to food, we didn't need to worry about flavor as much anymore.
So we could focus on producing as much food as possible, even if it didn't taste that great.
And then we just added artificial flavors to make it palatable.
It's like we've outsmarted ourselves.
And Schatzker even mentions more extreme examples of flavor-enhanced abuse, like flavored e-cigarettes and morphine lollipops.
So it's not just about making food taste better, it's about using flavor to manipulate our behavior.
Exactly. But there's hope, you know? Schatzker talks about his own experience of changing his eating habits and how it changed his cravings.
What happened?
Well, he started focusing on eating real, high-quality food, and he found that he started craving vegetables more and junk food less.
So it's possible to retrain your taste buds.
Absolutely. And he tells his great story about having this amazing fried chicken that made him want to get up and dance.
That's how good it was.
And he only ate a small amount, which suggests that real flavor can be incredibly satisfying, even in small doses.
So it's not just about quantity, it's about quality.
And he talks about a conversation he had with the chef Alain Ducasse, who said that the most important thing is to start with delicious ingredients.
So it's about celebrating the natural flavors of food, not covering them up with spices and sauces.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with dude chefs, who tend to over-flavor their food because the ingredients themselves aren't that great.
So it's about letting the ingredients speak for themselves.
And he tells this story about eating this bland chicken that was heavily seasoned, and afterward he had this intense craving for Doritos.
Even though he wasn't hungry.
Right. It's like his body was still searching for that satisfying flavor experience.
And then there's this whole thing about false chicken memories. People remember chicken from their childhood tasting amazing, even though they probably grew up eating the less flavorful modern broilers.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's like our memories of flavor can be influenced by nostalgia and cultural expectations.
And the fact that there's been so little research on chicken flavor in recent decades really shows how little attention we've paid to it.
We've been so focused on quantity and efficiency that we've forgotten about flavor.
But luckily, there are people like Linda Farmer who are doing research on how to improve the flavor of chicken through diet.
And it's also interesting to think about how we get pleasure from certain plant toxins like nicotine and caffeine.
It seems counterintuitive, right? Why would we enjoy things that are bad for us?
Well, Schatzker suggests that it might be an evolutionary mechanism that allows us to benefit from these compounds in small doses while avoiding harmful levels.
So it's like a built-in safety system.
In a way, yes. And there was a study in Denmark that looked at grocery store receipts.